Welcome to The Explainer. The whole debate between theism and atheism, it feels like it's been going on forever, right? It's one of those arguments that just never seems to end. But the source material we're digging into today suggests that maybe, just maybe, we've been arguing about the wrong thing this entire time. So let's just jump right in by flipping the script. Instead of asking the same old question, does God exist? What if we ask something different? What if both believing and disbelieving are actually perfectly rational responses to the same fundamental, messy problems of just being human? And that's really the heart of the idea from the research by Tennyson Samraj. It argues that the theism and atheism aren't just, blind faith on one side and cold, hard logic on the other. No, they're both justified belief decisions. They are conscious choices we make when we're confronted with the universe and have to figure out our place in it. Now, to really get this, we have to understand that the real debate isn't about proving God exists in the same way a table or a chair exists. It's about whether God's existence is necessary for the universe to make any sense at all. And the source material breaks this down into two very specific, kind of philosophical ideas of necessity. Okay, I know this slide looks a little complex, but stick with me. The core idea is actually pretty simple. The argument for God's existence basically splits into two parts. On one side, you have the logical need for a first cause, a cosmic starting pistol to get everything going. That's called de dicto necessity. On the other side, you've got the argument about the actual nature or essence of that first cause, and that's de re necessity. Let's break them down. So de dicto necessity is basically like a giant chain of dominoes. Everything we see in the universe is contingent, which is a fancy way of saying it depends on something else to exist. Your chair depends on the factory that made it, the factory on its builders, and on it goes. To avoid that chain going back forever, which gets logically weird, there has to be a first domino, an uncaused cause. It's a logical placeholder, a need for a starting point. And then there's de re necessity. This is where we take that logical placeholder, that first domino, and start to describe it. This argument says that the first cause has to be, by its very nature, non-contingent. It can't depend on anything else. Its existence is totally self-sufficient. It just is. And right there, that's where we get the concept of a necessarily existing immortal being we call God. Now, this distinction is absolutely crucial because it splits the whole debate into two very different questions. One, the paper argues, is actually pretty easy to deal with. The other one, well, that one's basically impossible to solve. The easy question is about a physical, testable being, a God you could meet for coffee. As the source paper puts it, if you set up a date and time and God's a no-show, well, you can falsify that claim of a physical existence. It operates on a level of evidence that we can actually observe. But the hard question, and this is where the debate really lives, that's a whole different ballgame. How do you test an abstract concept like non-contingent existence? You can't. It's an unfalsifiable idea. You can't prove it with an experiment, and you can't disprove it either. And this is the ground on which both theists and atheists have to build their entire case. Which brings us to the core of this whole analysis. If the debate really hinges on an idea you can't even test, how do theists and atheists build their logical arguments? Well, the source material actually maps it out for us, showing exactly where each path leads. And this diagram does a brilliant job of illustrating the different logical paths, so let's trace it out. A believer can start with theism and propose the existence of a necessary or non-contingent being. As you can see, that path is logically consistent. Now look at the atheist's path. If they try to argue for the non-existence of a non-existent being, which is that abstract, non-contingent idea of God we're talking about, they run into a logical contradiction. See that red X? You can't really argue for the non-existence of something that's defined as non-existent in that physical sense anyway. So the paper argues, the real rational decision isn't about proving or disproving, but about choosing to accept or reject the concept of a non-contingent being in the first place. Okay, so if the central argument is about an idea that can't be proven or disproven, why do we feel so compelled to pick a side? Why not just say, I don't know, and move on with our lives? The answer, according to this research, is that we aren't just abstract thinkers floating in a void. We are human beings who are grappling with the reality of our own existence. And that reality pretty much forces us to take a position. And what are those concerns? They're the biggest questions we can possibly ask. Where did all of this come from? What is this strange thing we call consciousness? How are we supposed to live a good life? What's the point of it all? And what do we do with the knowledge that we're all going to die? These are not optional questions. They demand some kind of framework for living. Tolstoy, who's cited in the paper, he put it perfectly. You can't really be neutral on these questions in your day-to-day life. You live as if there's a point, or you live as if there isn't. You act based on some kind of moral framework. So choosing to believe or disbelieve becomes this necessary, justified decision you make just to make sense of your own existence. This framework doesn't just reframe the debate, it also helps explain why it's so often filled with conflict and why it just seems to go on forever. The trouble really starts when one side takes its justified belief decision, remember, an answer to an unfalsifiable question, and treats it like it's an objective, verifiable truth that everyone else has to accept. The paper notes that when a creed claims to have the one and only truth, intolerance is thus intrinsic to it. And that's the root of dogmatism. And what's more, the paper points out that when different theistic groups can't even agree among themselves, when they're fighting over who has the correct version of the truth, it shifts the whole focus. The conflict isn't just between theism and atheism anymore, it's often within theism itself, which just complicates the entire conversation. So what's the solution here? The paper argues it's not for one side to finally win the debate. The path forward is secularism, not as an atheistic position, but as a framework that protects everyone's right to make their own justified belief decision, to live by their own conscience without imposing it on anybody else. And this leaves us with a final thought to chew on. By looking at the debate this way, we shift the focus. Maybe the point isn't to finally prove one side right. Maybe the real value is in recognizing that both theism and atheism are these profound human attempts to answer the same essential questions about what it even means to be alive.